Continuing on with our net zero energy consumption storyline here this afternoon, and we'll have Jamie Quinn from UCL present.
Thanks very much. I'll try and make this short because I'm quite interested in to see what the panel is going to say. There we are. Yeah, so I'm just going to talk a little bit about what heterogeneous computing is, my part in the energetic project, some challenges we've faced, some very, very early results, and try and use that to inform how we can effectively use heterogeneous computing to improve the energy efficiency of our codes. So, heterogeneous computing, the idea of, on the hardware side, CPUs plus some other coprocessor. Could be GPUs, FPGAs, and all sorts of more exotic things like data processing units and intelligence processing units, whatever else. And often those coprocessors match some kind of algorithmic need, like the GPU and deep neural net kind of symbiosis. And of course, most large systems are indeed now heterogeneous, just for performance reasons. GPUs seem to be pretty damn good at doing many HPC tasks. On the software side, we can harness this kind of heterogeneity through different models. We can distribute similar work performed by some algorithm amongst all processing units, giving some to the CPU and some to the GPU, some to an FPGA, whatever else we have attached to a machine. Or we can be a little bit more sophisticated, a little bit more clever for more complex codes and distribute particular components of an algorithm to appropriate processing units in order to make best use of those processing units, depending on the characteristics of our particular components of our algorithm. So, keeping that in mind, I want to talk about the energetic project, how we actually use, how we measure heterogeneous systems in terms of energy. Michael's already introduced that a little bit, so I'll skip some of this. But essentially, just to remind you, we're wanting to answer, or continue to answer the question, what classes of algorithms are most energy efficient on which architectures? But with some secondary questions, what's actually a good portable way to run these energy benchmarks? How can a user actually do this? How well are HPC systems currently set up to measure energy? And can we find some way to incorporate energy measurements into existing benchmark frameworks, such as the Excalibur benchmarking effort? The way we've been actually testing different algorithm classes is by running different benchmarks, HPC Challenge that includes HPL, HPCG, Rodinia, which is a little suite that represents 7 dwarfs. If you don't know who the dwarfs are, they're kind of classic examples of different algorithms that represent a whole slew of HPC workloads, as well as many MD, totaling about 10 benchmarks, but that's plenty because they're quite difficult to get running on different systems. The lesson here, and I'll speak a little bit more about different challenges that we've had, finding FPGA benchmarks is really, really difficult. There's not an awful lot out there. And so that's been kind of constraining us in terms of our benchmark choices. We're really wanting to represent different workloads across large UK HPC systems, but we're still constrained by this FPGA implementation. The way we're actually measuring energy has been a myriad of things, because ultimately we're wanting not just we've got our own system that we can, we've got root access, we can install whatever we want, and we can measure the power draw from the wall, but we're also using HPC systems across the UK, most notably Cirrus, and so we want to kind of understand what's available to a user on current systems. How easy is it for the average user to just go on and actually start measuring the energy of their code? And it's actually quite difficult, mainly because there's this slew of different vendors. Intel, we're using RAPL, NVIDIA GPUs, we're using NVIDIA SMI and the management layer. Xilinx, we're using their power analyzer. AMD CPUs and Intel FPGAs, we currently haven't started playing with energy measurements, so if anyone's done that before, please do talk to us. And of course, this has been already done, and Alistair spoke a little bit about this, but this kind of coarse-grained energy measurement of like whole job energy, we're not really wanting to do power profiling or energy profiling. We don't want to know like which parts of which code use up the most energy. We just want to know the whole thing. Is this better handled by the scheduler, where a sysadmin can just set up the appropriate kind of measurement and then give the user that data? I believe yes. So let me talk very brief results, and this kind of informs some very brief conclusions, or very preliminary conclusions that aren't particularly astounding. But essentially, this is running both the GPU version of HPL and the CPU version of HPL, which I didn't even let finish because it was taking so long. And this is also the energy taken to make a cup of tea, just for context. So the GPU version of HPL, the idle time that the CPU was just kind of sitting there doing not much else rather than just managing the GPUs, was quite a significant part of the total energy, where you see the blue bar is the amount used by the GPU and the red bar is the amount used by the CPU. Whereas the CPU version of HPL, where the GPUs were still there, they just weren't doing anything, they actually still used up a pretty significant amount of time. And here it actually only ran to 10% before I decided to kill it, because it was using up an enormous amount of energy. So the kind of takeaway here, although again preliminary results, please pinch of salt, idle components matter. Some imaging process results. We've been playing with some image processing benchmarks as well. And I won't go into the details of what the CPU, GPU, or FPGA are, because it's not particularly important for these results. I just want to point out that actually the data transfer on the GPU took an enormous amount of energy compared to the execution, which is what you'd expect. But again, preliminary results. I don't think this experiment is particularly good, because the execution time for the GPU was under a second, so it doesn't really work out very well. And we don't currently have that data transfer for the FPGA. But I just wanted to show off that the FPGA, in terms of energy use, is comparable to the GPU. In fact, it was a little bit less. I had to times the height of that bar by 10 just to get it to show up on this plot. At any rate, it's quite significant that the accelerators, the GPU and the FPGA here, are using significantly less energy than the CPU for this particular case. There's obviously some cases where the CPU can be more efficient. So Michael spoke a little bit about this, but I want to kind of expand on the challenges that I faced in energetic. And again, it's only halfway through, so there'll be plenty more, I presume. Yeah, there are just very few benchmarks available that target FPGAs. And in fact, we couldn't find any what I call truly heterogeneous benchmarks, benchmarks that are able to as I mentioned before, manage to split off some of the data to some of the computation to the FPGA, some to a GPU, some to a CPU. We couldn't really find any benchmarks that were doing that, that also targeted FPGAs. We found a lot of the energy reporting on the HPC systems can require root access, particularly for things, in fact, even beyond root access, because it was accessing like IPMI layers and that kind of thing, which is only available to folk sometimes even in the server room. So the point I'm making is just for the end user, it's quite tricky getting some of these numbers. And again, I mentioned that the different vendors have different mechanisms that they actually report energy through, making it a little bit challenging for an end user to just go onto a new system and then actually manage to measure energy on it. And essentially mixed up in the energy reporting requiring root access is that whole node or rack energy reporting is just not available at all. So I tried to come up with some conclusions, but ended up just asking even more questions. FPGA HLS, high-level synthesis of FPGA code, is still very early days. I think there's many benchmarks that show that it's energy efficient on a lot of different workloads, not all, but more energy efficient than GPUs. But it's still an excruciating developer experience. It's horrible. If you've ever programmed for FPGAs, the compilation cycle alone just takes hours and hours and hours for simple programs. So more benchmarks really are required in order to understand, is porting one code to an FPGA actually worth the energy efficiency or actual performance efficiency? Is that worth it? The other point, which obviously goes against making heterogeneous codes, but it's quite complicated. Making code that runs on lots of different things and is performant on all those different devices is very complex, and I don't think much work. I mean, Alistair kind of mentioned this about the failed jobs, but there's not much information on what the impact of bugs are on energy use. You know, if I develop a heterogeneous code, but it's actually filled with bugs because it was more complex than the code that I just could have ran on just a GPU, what's the actual impact of that in terms of energy? And again, is writing a heterogeneous code worth the potential energy efficiency? More benchmarking work required. As well as I alluded to, and we've seen other talks that have said similar things, idle power seems significant. Should we actually be turning all codes into heterogeneous codes so they can access all architectures, or should we be able to power down idle hardware even further? And lastly, user space power monitoring is really quite tough, and it seems like schedulers are the more appropriate place to actually keep these statistics. So, to answer the question, how can we use heterogeneous computing to improve energy efficiency? With the help of benchmarking, more benchmarking efforts, it should be able to inform kind of developer porting decisions to make sure that software targets the most energy efficient hardware for its particular algorithmic characteristics. As well, we should have HPC systems which are able to facilitate that have a balance of different architectures, different accelerators that can target specific workloads or can spreads of workloads. And I think HPC systems should be exposing energy measurements, not just through installation of the useful kind of tools that we've been playing around with, but also be able to have the scheduler just do a very simple, granular kind of energy measurement. And yeah, all of this is essentially enabled by benchmarking. We should be using decent benchmarks and large benchmark suites to inform these kind of porting and procurement decisions for HPC systems. So, thank you very much.